What if the earliest sign of dementia didn't look like dementia at all? No memory lapses, no confusion, just a strange phrase. A moment so subtle you almost overlook it. But years later, you realize it was the very first warning that something was wrong. Most people never notice it. Even doctors often miss it until it's too late. Because the brain doesn't always cry for help. Sometimes it whispers. And if you're not paying attention, that whisper can go unheard. This video reveals what many families overlook until it's already too late. Before we dive in, if you care about keeping your mind sharp and protecting your memory for years to come, hit subscribe and turn on notifications now. That way, you'll never miss the tips that could make all the difference for you or someone you love. Let's stay one step ahead together. Number 1. Why do I keep misplacing everything? For Marcia, age 70, it began with little things: her glasses, her keys, her phone. She'd set them down, blame someone else, and later forget she'd ever touched them. That question, why do I keep misplacing everything, haunted her for 2 years before she learned she had early onset dementia. By then, she'd lost more than just objects. She was losing confidence in her own mind. A medical review showed that repeated concerns about losing or misplacing items are among the most common self-reported symptoms in the preclinical phase of dementia. The hippocampus, the brain's memory hub, starts to weaken. People don't just forget where they put something, they forget moving it at all. That broken link in the memory chain creates helplessness and frustration, which can lead to denial or blame. Eventually, they stop trusting their mind, and facing that can be terrifying. When this question becomes a regular pattern, it's not just ordinary forgetfulness anymore. If you're following along so far, type 1 in the comments, and remember to click the like button. Thank you. Number 2. Why is everyone speaking so quickly? Ernst, 76, began saying that conversations felt like a blur, even though his hearing tests were perfectly normal. He told his wife, "I can't keep up anymore. Everyone's talking too fast." At first, no one thought much of it, but that strange remark appeared nearly 3 years before his Alzheimer's diagnosis, and it was the reason he stopped going to social gatherings. Research shows that early cognitive decline can affect auditory processing speed, the brain's ability to follow words in real time, especially in noisy places. It's not a hearing problem, it's a processing problem. The ears work fine, but the brain can't keep pace, turning ordinary conversation into mental exhaustion. Even in quiet rooms, they might lag behind, asking for things to be repeated just to keep up. This change can feel isolating, and many people start pulling away from others. So when someone says, "People are talking too fast" or "too much," the real issue may not be the room's noise, but the brain's fading rhythm. Number 3. You didn't tell me that. Grace, 69, kept insisting her children never mentioned family plans, even though they had. At first, they called it stubbornness, but in truth, she was already slipping. Her early Alzheimer's was confirmed 2 years after these disputes began, and her family wished they had recognized the signs sooner. Research shows that people with early short-term memory decline often deflect, not out of dishonesty, but because they genuinely believe they were never told. It happens because the moment never registered in their memory. To them, everyone else seems mistaken. This defensive confusion appears when the brain fails to form a solid memory trace, So the person assumes the event didn't happen. It can strain relationships, causing emotional distance and frustration on both sides. Repeated denials aren't simply attitude, they're signs that the brain is starting to drop fragments of reality. Number 4. That's not what I meant. Lucille, 74, began mixing up words. She'd use the wrong name, leave sentences unfinished, or ask questions that didn't quite make sense. She didn't notice it herself, and when corrected, she'd get defensive. "That's not what I said," she'd insist. It was nearly 2 years before her Alzheimer's diagnosis, but her language skills were already unraveling, slowly and almost invisibly. Experts explain that language decline often starts early in cognitive disorders. People may misuse words, lose parts of their vocabulary, or say things they never intended to. The unsettling part? They usually don't realize it's happening. As language centers weaken, the brain begins producing incomplete or jumbled sentences, yet the person believes they're speaking clearly. This growing disconnect fuels frustration and misunderstanding, especially with loved ones who don't understand why communication feels so strained. When someone repeatedly insists, "That's not what I said," it can signal that language and self-awareness are beginning to drift apart. Number 5. I think something's wrong with my brain. 4 years before her Alzheimer's diagnosis, Diane, 71, began saying this quietly to her daughter. It wasn't panic, just a deep, uneasy awareness. "I'm not forgetting things," she said. "I just feel off." Her doctor told her she was fine, but that strange feeling stayed. Gradually, it grew stronger, even though she couldn't explain why. Experts say people in the earliest stage of decline often sense that something isn't right long before any test can detect it. This awareness is called subjective cognitive decline, and studies show it can appear years before measurable symptoms. It's not about forgetting names or getting lost. It's about a widening gap between how a person feels inside and how they appear on the outside. That gap can last quietly for years, noticed by no one else. When someone starts saying this, even in passing, don't dismiss it. It could be the brain's first real cry for help. Number 6. I just don't feel like myself anymore. Nancy, 67, told her family she felt dull, like something inside her had dimmed. They thought it was depression, but nothing helped. That phrase, "I don't feel like myself," was the start of something deeper. It took more than 2 years for her diagnosis to come: frontotemporal dementia. The emotional shift had already hollowed out the person she used to be. A medical study found that personality, motivation, and emotional changes can appear long before memory loss in certain forms of dementia. People may lose their spark, feel disconnected from their identity, and struggle to explain what's wrong, except to say they're no longer themselves. Unlike depression, this sense of detachment doesn't fade with time or therapy. It's a quiet sign that the brain's emotional wiring is beginning to change. To others, the person may seem fine, but to them, the difference feels painfully real. Are these clinical signs helpful so far? Type 1 if they are, or 0 if you'd like me to cover other early symptoms next. Your feedback guides what I share in future videos. Number 7. Stop changing things. I can't keep up. 3 years after Ronald, 75, became obsessed with routine, doctors diagnosed him with mild cognitive impairment. But the first warning came much earlier. when he started getting irritated by tiny changes. A new cereal box design, furniture moved, or dinner served differently, his family noticed. "I just want things to stay the same," he'd say. It was strange. He'd always been easygoing. But that rigidity slowly crept into every part of his day. Research shows that people in early decline often lose cognitive flexibility, the ability to adjust to change or new routines. What used to be simple becomes stressful. Even small disruptions can feel overwhelming, as if the brain can't handle new patterns without anxiety or confusion. It's not stubbornness, it's mental overload, the brain struggling to cope. If someone who once welcomed change now dreads it, it could be more than mood. It may be an early warning. Number 8. Everyone's against me lately. Before George, 78, was diagnosed with Lewy body dementia, something darker appeared. 2 years earlier, he began accusing neighbors of spying on him and even claimed his daughter was hiding things. He wasn't angry, he was uneasy. But the suspicion kept growing until his world started to feel hostile and unsafe. Studies show that early paranoia and suspicion can appear before major memory loss, especially in certain dementia types. Suspicion starts twisting reality, making people misread others' motives and cues. It's not just fear, it's the brain misfiring, changing how social intent is processed. Even loved ones can begin to seem like threats, and these mistaken beliefs often intensify over time, making help harder to accept. This kind of suspicion is one of the most painful symptoms for families to face. When someone suddenly believes others are against them, it's rarely just a phase. It's often the brain itself that's turning against reality. You're the one who keeps messing things up. Ben, 69, was never quick to anger until something inside him shifted. He began snapping at his wife over small mistakes, blaming her whenever something went wrong. "You told me the wrong time," he'd argue. "You're always confusing me on purpose." These reactions began nearly 3 years before his Alzheimer's diagnosis. By then, the damage to his relationships was already done. Studies show that irritability, defensiveness, and blame shifting are often among the first emotional changes in dementia. As memory weakens, anxiety builds, but because they can't express that fear, they redirect it toward others. It's not simple anger, it's a form of self-protection. They feel confused and vulnerable, so they cover it with frustration or accusation. That lashing out is a shield, hiding the fear they can't name. When anger and blame become constant, especially in someone who used to be calm, it may not be personality. It may be fear disguised as hostility. They don't always forget first. Sometimes the earliest clues appear in what they say: an odd comment, a strange question, a sudden change in tone. These aren't random quirks, they're early cracks in the mind's foundation. Notice them early, and you have a chance to help. Ignore them, and the silence that follows is something you can't undo. Before you go, subscribe for practical, science-based insights on protecting your brain. Which of these early warning phrases have you heard or noticed in someone you know? Your comments and questions help us support more families, so please share below. And remember, sharing this video could help someone you care about notice the signs in time. Your feedback keeps us creating life-changing, research-backed health content for you and for the people you love.